Hello, and welcome to this workshop from Kelly, who's talking about carbon border adjustment mechanism. Kelly is currently in Johannesburg and at the Gordon Institute, and I'll leave her to explain about that and to introduce herself and talk about this um, interesting subject. And I'm very keen to learn about the impact on African countries and enterprises down there. So, Kelly, over to you, and thank you very much for taking part in this.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Thank you so much for inviting me. And yeah, so as mentioned, I'm sure people have heard that I split my time between the Netherlands and South Africa, but I am originally South African. And this is a piece of research I'll talk about in a moment, but I think I'll also just introduce myself. Let me see. There you go. So yes, I'm faculty at GIBS, which is the Gordon Institute of Business Science. And then we are actually the business school of Pretoria University, even though we're located in Johannesburg. And there I'm part of the strategy and sustainability faculty, looking at issues around climate change, leadership, how organizations actually integrate climate change or climate thinking into their organizations. And then I work independently at TIGC, which is really just consultancy, research, advisory work around linking Africa and European organizations, trying to bring them closer together. And a lot of that work is also looking at social impact assessment, for example, and monitoring and evaluation. So trying to think about how to do projects in Africa to as high a standard as possible. And then, of course, I'm a fellow at the Schumacher Institute, which is what brings me here today. And I have a PhD in management and organization studies, but really I'm a sociologist. So I really like looking at the big picture and then drilling down into how that influences organizations and people in society. So I like to just always clarify that I am a sociologist at heart. And then in terms of my research, I've just put a few examples here. Really just to highlight that my core focus is the African angle. So I like to take an issue like CBAM and or renewable energy or AI, and to think, what does this mean in Africa for African organizations? So I've looked at quite a broad area and different sectors and unpacked different issues with that lens in the sense of thinking about how do we understand what these sort of broad issues mean for the African continent. And then I also do little bits and bobs, again, the same thing, thinking in terms of maybe the geopolitics as we see the world fragmenting more and more. What is Africa's place in this? How does Africa take a leadership role? How do African countries sort of represent their own interests? And that's sort of across the Dutch and South African press. And I like to try and just bring those two together and show both sides that actually there's a lot more value in working together than in going apart or pulling apart. Because to be honest, I do have some concerns about the China-Russia lean that South Africa and many African countries seem to be taking, and what that means for the future. So that's me in a nutshell. And then in terms of the actual CBAM research, so it was a really nice project. It was a collaboration between myself and another colleague at GIBS, Tanya, and a colleague of ours in Strathmore in Kenya, Mumbi. And so we decided to look at this issue from those two countries' perspectives. And we had a relatively small sample of interviews, but really quite high-level respondents to try and dig into CBAM. And as I think you know by now, trying to understand what it means for Africa and African organizations. And so this is basically just what I'll cover is explaining a little bit about what CBAM is, why we wanted to study it, looking at the context of operation quite broadly, the implementation of CBAM, some of the tensions that we saw around that, the two cases of South Africa and Kenya, and then just present some of the thoughts and the perspectives of the various respondents at the end, just to bring it together. And just so you know, I'm also happy with questions during or after. So if you have anything, just feel free to interrupt me. So What is CBAM? This is the million-dollar question. So it was a policy developed by the EU, and it obviously has the intention of meeting the EU's carbon emissions and climate change goals, which are quite advanced, as you know. And it was really around trying to minimize this issue of carbon leakage, which is where European organizations would offshore to countries that have lower regulatory standards around carbon emissions and then import back into the EU. So the thinking is really that they want to avoid this, offshoring and organizations circumventing the regulations and then ultimately not being able to attain their goals in as good a way as possible. And you can see there it links to the trading allowances and the certificates that are already sort of in existence, and it's all about obviously calculating what emissions are where in the various processes. So it was really essentially an EU-focused policy that then has impact and offshoots and spillover across far more broadly. Next. So there's two goals of the policy. So ensuring that the cost of the carbon that goes into the production is actually reflected in the price of the good at the end of the day, and also to try and sort of raise the regulatory levels and standards in production across all of the partner countries that import and export into the EU, and with the obvious aim, of course, of addressing climate change. And what is quite interesting, I've had a lot of, where I've presented this research or spoken about it in other forums, people immediately come up to me and they say, it's just the same as the deforestation, as the CSRD and the CSDDD. So a lot of the issues that we talk about or that we will talk about now are common and shared in these other regulations as well, really in the way that the policies are created and communicated. So with the same kind of high ideals, but a bit of tension in the implementation and practice. So then just looking quite broadly at the context, obviously we have this big and ongoing conversation about emissions, who's responsible historically for emissions, who should be responsible for addressing the issues of climate change now as they manifest, flooding and those kinds of things. And this idea of common but differentiated responsibilities. So the idea, of course, that we all share the climate and we are all responsible in some way, but how do we then go forward in an equitable way, given the challenges that we've had? And where it gets interesting is with Russia's invasion of the Ukraine, anyway, we saw this big crisis in the EU and in Europe around gas prices increasing and energy becoming much more expensive. And that led, in South Africa, for example, our coal exports went through the roof because Europe was worried. So they needed to keep the lights on, they needed to keep the heating on. So we saw the boom in terms of coal exports from South Africa, but at the same time, this push for African countries to go renewable and to go green and to transform their economies. So that then created this feeling of, wait, there's a double standard here from an African perspective, and started to create a bit of tension. And the tension then flows through into this idea of how does Africa develop? And of course, African countries, African companies, how do we develop at the same time as being aware of climate and addressing climate issues, develop in a responsible way that is sort of climate proof for the future, but also, make use of the minerals and the resources that we have at the moment. And that's it's a very fine line, and it's a very interesting and tricky debate to have. And all of this means, of course, that we have a very contested environment, which is great because it makes for interesting research. So, and then here you can just see at a very high level who's responsible for the historic emissions. And you'll see, so my two countries, the Netherlands there has a 0.7 in the orange block, and South Africa's a 1.3. Of course, South Africa's energy is largely coal-fired, so very dirty, but we also have a population of something like 60 million compared to, I think, 18 million in the Netherlands. So very different size of countries then, populations. So these, and I think these graphs or these charts are interesting, but obviously there's a lot behind them as well. And China's emissions, for example, that obviously, as the manufacturing workshop of the world, I think a lot of emissions have been offshored out of the EU and to China, which then also pushes up there. It's easy then to say, oh, look at China, look at how high their emissions are. But, while we order online, all of the products that are made there. And then the second issue is really this idea of protectionism, and that the policies like CBAM are subsidies, they're walls, they're tariffs, they're a way to keep emerging markets out or African countries out. And it just makes it much more difficult for organizations in Africa to compete and to sort of find a level playing field. And what's very interesting is that while we see that, the Inflation Reduction Act and the Green Deal creating more obstacles to trade, in Africa, we're going the other way and really trying to open up with the African Continental Free Trade Area, which is now in the process of being operationalized to try and lower barriers, to lower these obstacles to trade, and to really encourage and facilitate intra-African trade much more. So we see these two competing and diverging imperatives there. And then this is basically just a couple of examples of this protectionism or the levels of protectionism, and to see how it does sort of have this global north, global south sort of feel to it, and the tensions that has, and these are obviously sources from several regions across the world. So I think it's something that hasn't been addressed enough in my perception from the EU side, to say, what is it that they're doing to make sure that there is trade, that it doesn't come across as a protectionist barrier. And then these are a few slides just around the other side. So what the protectionism does for African players and African actors. So then we get this very strong narrative of, it's our destiny. We're in control. We should be allowed to use our resources. And, we're being held back by these green deals and by the protectionist policies of the EU and the US. And then that very easily falls under this kind of neo-colonial umbrella. You're telling us what to do. You're imposing your views on us. And you can see here again, it's seen as a risk. It's seen as a challenge for African people to develop. It's holding people back. And then again, this notion of hypocrisy. So on the one hand, telling Africans that they need to transition away from fossil fuels, and then signing deals for fossil fuels within the next week. So whether or not, I think my feeling with these kinds of issues is that whether or not it's true, it's the optics, and it's the conversation around it, and it's the way that these deals are made and the conversations are had that causes the tension. And then again, so just zooming in a little bit on Africa, again, this idea of hypocrisy is that we are, and as Africans, disproportionately affected by climate change, compounded by the fact that we lack resources, we lack infrastructure, we lack often the human capital and the skills to properly address the climate change events. And yet we are not responsible for the majority of the climate emissions or the carbon emissions. So again, I may have mentioned there's a bit of a tension here. And then turning now to the actual implementation of the policy. So some of the challenges and the issues with CBAM are that it's obviously a bureaucratic headache and a human capital headache, in the sense that not all member states, as you can see, have the people to actually conduct the verification of the carbon emissions. So there needs to be a whole lot of work done on the European side in order to actually make this a seamless process, never mind what needs to happen on the African side in order to comply as well. So we see that there's a huge learning curve that needs to take place. And the downside there is that there's a risk, or the expectation that the cost of reporting and the cost of complying with CBAM will ultimately push prices up and send it the way of customers and consumers. And the policy, the way that it's been designed, obviously there's a kind of a phase-in process, and certain sectors are earmarked for more immediate tariffs, and others will come down the line. And you can see, so Egypt, Morocco, South Africa, for example, are the most vulnerable to CBAM and to the adverse effects of it. And these are also three very big economies, three central economies in their region. So if the exports in these markets take a knock, it has broader impacts for their regions. And countries like Mozambique and Zimbabwe are obviously on the other end of the spectrum, in the sense that they really, exports are the lifeblood. They rely on as much economic activity. They're trying to grow. They're trying to lift their people out of poverty. And so if they are adversely affected by a policy like CBAM, it has significant ramifications for them. And then looking at the actual, in terms of assessing this kind of vulnerability, we can see that there are two core ways in which CBAM can affect a country. So the first is exposure. So how much, what is the reliance of a particular country in terms of its exports to the EU? And the other is the vulnerability in terms of how easily can the country adapt and mitigate some of its current practices to fall in line with CBAM and or to find alternative trade partners. So we'll just look at this. This is basically just a nicer way of saying it, or a nicer way of visualizing it. So it's exposure and vulnerability, with the two components of vulnerability there. And then if we dig into vulnerability a little bit more, I think if you look at the last row there, the capacity to measure and report emissions, I think for African countries that's a huge hurdle, because the quality already of maybe a national census or the statistical bodies and organizations within countries isn't necessarily at the level that it should be. So there needs to be a training of people, upskilling, getting systems and processes in place in order to meet the CBAM requirements, which is probably something that would have happened anyway, but it needs to happen at a much quicker rate in order to comply with CBAM. And then my favorite word, tension. So looking at some of the resistance to CBAM, we can see that, again, as I mentioned, it's the bureaucracy, it's the admin, it's the dissemination of information in order to comply that really needs to be ramped up, and that there's a lot of uncertainty around that. People are not sure exactly, how to comply, what reporting is needed, what the dates are. So while there has been some communication, I think that there's quite a lot, there's a big gap in terms of what is needed in terms of that information to trickle down. And then we see here again this notion that the CBAM will push the burden to emerging markets. Basically, as the EU tries to achieve their targets, it's the responsibility of African partners to start to address that. And while there was initially talk of exemptions and some kind of support for the least developed countries, so here you could imagine Swaziland, Eswatini, and Lesotho, for example. These are countries that will be affected by CBAM, but really need a lot more help and a lot more guidance in terms of being actually able to address the policy and to meet the policy standards. And what happened there is that there was talk of the LDCs having some support, but then in the final policy, it didn't actually materialize. And again, so then that creates some tensions. And I think what also, it's a double-edged sword in the sense that it means that there's more encouragement to get aligned with CBAM, but also a bit more of a threat is that the UK, Japan, Canada, and Australia are all increasingly thinking about developing their own carbon border adjustment mechanisms or their own carbon tariffs that will work in the same or in a similar way. So that just, again, bumps up the hurdle for emerging markets and African actors. There you go. And so some of the things that we saw around this resistance is that there's concern that you can see I've highlighted here, that CBAM will basically push back gains that have been made in beneficiation for the continent, and that it will be easier to just export raw materials that are beneficiated in Europe than it is, basically in order to comply with CBAM. and sort of leading to a bit of deindustrialization, the concern about job loss, the concern again that it's really penalizing emerging markets. And this is my favorite quote at the bottom on the right there that says, it's a well-designed policy for Europe. So it really needs to be, I think, aware a little bit more of the broader impacts that the policy has. And I think that it also links very closely to this notion of the just transition. So there's a lot of talk about that, particularly in South Africa. We're working towards a just transition. We're trying to make the move away from fossil fuels, to introduce more and more renewable energy. And you can see here there's this call for just trade for energy partnerships. So how do we get a little bit more innovative and creative and find ways to boost renewables without creating the trade barriers? And so there need to be different mechanisms and different support policies and structures in place to facilitate this. And you can see the key keywords or the buzzwords really are fair and inclusive, and thinking about the impact on individuals in countries. And also, I think what CBAM has neglected is to link into these nationally defined development priorities. It sort of sidesteps them. And then that leaves countries sort of scrambling a little bit, trying to achieve two things at once with limited resources, limited time, limited human capital. The plus side is that as organizations and countries start to try to adapt and meet the CBAM requirements, the administrative complexity that is there means that we will have to improve our reporting standards, have to start focusing on this much more, have to start building the human capitals, the skills required. And so there is the potential that it will accelerate processes that are already in place and boost skills levels and really focus people's attention on the issues of climate and carbon emissions. And then we'll look now at South Africa and Kenya. So South Africa, I'm sure everybody's also heard about the load shedding that we used to have here up until recently. I don't know load shedding, but the power cuts. We used to have intermittent power cuts for several years. And touch wood now, since I think about January or February, we haven't had load shedding, which is really nice. But our power infrastructure is very outdated. It's very reliant on coal. And the coal that we use is really, it's not the best quality. So it's very dirty, it's very polluting. We do have a very high carbon emissions from that coal, which means that South African organizations are then struck by the direct and indirect emissions. And it's difficult to move away from that. Admittedly, I think in part because of the load shedding, we have now moved more and more to renewables, and we see a lot of that coming online now, which is really great. But because obviously we have phenomenal solar potential, but it takes time to also filter through and for the infrastructure to catch up as well. And given South Africa's exposure in terms of exports to the EU, we are very, very vulnerable to CBAM if we don't comply. And you can see here the third bullet point there highlights again this tension between internal processes that have been going on. Particularly, South Africa is a great example of this, where the coal interests are so vested at the government level, at the union level, because it's a huge source of employment. And so to start to make or move the conversation and move the dial towards renewable energy, it is this kind of very delicate compromise that has taken place. And then for CBAM to come and be imposed on the country, it can disrupt that. And with all of these tensions that we've seen, the hypocrisy, the paternalism, it can upset this kind of delicate balance in a particular country. And then as a result of that, obviously South Africa has lodged a complaint at the World Trade Organization around the kind of protectionist implications of CBAM. This is a very busy slide, I'm sorry, but I thought it might be useful afterwards for people to have a read. But so what South Africans are thinking about is really leveraging the African Continental Free Trade Area to engage with the EU on CBAM as a region, to leverage some of the concessions and finance arrangements that are available perhaps at regional levels to be able to address the CBAM requirements. And there's also a call on the one hand to say, as part of BRICS, for example, and part of the Global South, to really lobby and to use our position as a member, as a voice in the Global South, and to sort of come together, show strength as the Global South and resist CBAM. But on the other hand, there's a very clear awareness that we are just a small economy on a very grand global scale, and we're not that relevant, and therefore our economy depends on us ultimately meeting CBAM. So again, this issue of like, how do we contest it and try to shape it that it in a way that meets our economic needs, but also comply as much as possible, because we are still a developing country in that sense, and need as much economic development as possible. And then this is just looping back to the mining, which will obviously also be very heavily affected. And you can see the last point there is really just the size of the sector in terms of contribution to GDP and also in terms of employment. And then you can see how that shapes the national conversation around mining, around decarbonization, and really around this just transition. So how do we move communities away from mining, but reskill, keep jobs, and try to ensure that we don't have a collapse in that area, and with all the negative spillovers that will lead to. And then Kenya, so this is a completely different picture, which is quite nice. So they are much more climate focused, I think, than South Africa. They have a very strong renewable energy production pool already. And despite this, I think what's interesting is that they are still calling for better relations with the EU. So despite being in a very different position to South Africa, they have the same need to be seen, to be heard, to, you can see at the bottom there, to restructure the way that we engage with the EU, to bring it more in line, to have more equal and equitable relationships, and to think about different ways of funding to bring development through renewable energy in an advanced and accelerated way. And so here you can see that clean energy mix, it's phenomenal. It's the complete opposite of the South African picture. And therefore, again, Kenya's role in its region, in the EAC, the East African Community, if they can leverage their green energy and their position there, it really can accelerate access into the EU for the country and for the region. And given the structure of their economy, again, South Africa's is obviously very mining intensive and minerals intensive. Kenya's is much more diverse, and so they have far less vulnerability and exposure, which really helps them in terms of not being as adversely impacted by CBAM. And so there's this really nice view in the country that has a competitive advantage that it can exploit, and particularly, again, in line with the African Free Trade Area, to try and rethink partnerships, rethink trade patterns, and to leverage its experience and also its position on the continent, kind of geographically, to promote green manufacturing and energy exports. So I really like this kind of opportunity mindset, and really thinking about what I find what's interesting here is in one of the comments earlier from the news pieces, they were saying leapfrogging is a risk, but for Kenya, leapfrogging is a great thing. And I think Kenya have the experience through M-Pesa, for example, their mobile money, of leapfrogging in a really positive and powerful way. And they're really open to innovation. They have this Silicon Savannah where they're trying to drive digital innovation. So leapfrogging for Kenyans is a wonderful thing and a great opportunity. And again, so if I think I have it somewhere, but if partnerships can be redrawn and trade lines can be redrawn within the African continent, then Kenya can be an export hub into the EU almost on behalf of the continent. Beneficiation can happen there, value add can happen there. So I think Kenya will be an interesting country to watch going forward if they can really leverage this position. And then just drilling down now into what people have actually said about CBAM. So this should not be a surprise in that it's criticized as being very top down, and it's seen as imposing the policy on the continent without really having consultation and engagement. I think that there were very high level consultations and there was a dialogue that took place at a very senior level. But I think that basically CBAM, the EU needs a roadshow, and they need to go from country to country, from city to city, and say, this is what's happening, this is why, and to really promote the positive side of CBAM. And the lack of consultation is again one of those key sources of tension. And there's critique, or there's some people say, yeah, CBAM, it's not really a protectionist measure, it's not a trade measure, it is really all about the environment. But I think that argument is largely getting lost in the sense of that African countries are forced to comply with CBAM, that it's not a conversation. Sorry. And then this opportunity lens. So the African Continental Free Trade Area, this is really seen as maybe coming at the right time. That policy is just being operationalized at the moment, so it'll be ramping up more and more. And we do see that there is the possibility to, as I mentioned, to leverage the trade within these areas, within regions, within existing trade blocks, to really maximize the African potential, and to leverage green energy where we have it, to leverage human capital where we have it. Obviously, we have a huge population that are ready to work. So if we can change the way that we think about CBAM, there's really the opportunity to accelerate development across the continent. But it's to be honest, I think that this is a fairly limited view for now. But again, I think if Kenya, as an example, can also basically have their own roadshow, encourage and incentivize partnerships, then there's a lot of positive potential. And then I think maybe the unintended consequence of this, of the policy for Africa might be that they'd bypass the EU entirely. So as organizations and countries need to start complying, if they fall behind, we may have an entire bloc in the global south that fails to meet CBAM needs, that starts to trade with each other, which I think it's really not the ideal situation, because then nobody needs to concern themselves with regulations around emissions or with trying to produce goods in a cleaner way. So this one, I have mixed feelings about whether or not this is a good thing. It might be helpful in terms of having a more balanced trade portfolio, but what it means for the climate, I think, might be less positive in the long run. And then there are 2 points that were made around finance. And the first was really that companies are looking to their governments to negotiate with the EU and to think about how to achieve the CBAM targets in a better way, and for governments themselves to think about tax incentives, to think about policy, to think about skills development, and to really work as a partner of business in support of attaining these compliance with CBAM. And then at a second level, it's the question of where does our money go? So if African organizations are paying the revenues, they flow into the EU via CBAM, then what happens? So there was talk of this kind of innovation fund, and then the money would flow back to Africa. But there are a lot of questions around, well, why doesn't it stay here? Or how can we rethink that financial model, that the money doesn't leave the continent to come back in the form of aid or some other kind of support? It should be much more localized, I think, in terms of also in order to keep organizations online and to build support and some kind of a coalition for CBAM. And then I mentioned this sort of at the beginning, but what CBAM signals to us is a lot more than just the policy itself. So it really raises the question across the continent, is climate change being taken seriously by businesses? Are organizations thinking through to the long term, or is it just a focus on really short-term goals and the bottom line in the now? And how do we stimulate that conversation? How do we drive that forward without being so top down and without it being imposed from the outside? The next question is, of course, this idea of competitive advantage and strengths and leveraging the free trade area. How can we use that to boost development in a clean way, in a way that does help to address some of the climate change challenges, and also that makes African countries more robust in dealing with climate-related events? And then this, and I've written about this, I showed at the beginning, some of the softer issues, I think, are the relationship between the EU and also the US and Africa, I think, is starting to fray because of these kinds of policies and the very top-down, heavy lack of consultation way that they are imposed. And then I wrote recently about FOCAC, the China-Africa Forum, and there it's a completely different conversation. African leaders are welcomed as equals, and that obviously will pull African stakeholders to China, to Russia, to Iran, to the BRICS. And that, I think, doesn't make me the most comfortable, as I mentioned. And so basically, just to wrap up, one of our respondents said that, as you can see, so we can fight the speed of implementation, but not the principle, and we would be better off decarbonizing in the long run. And I think that this is so important because basically this is the crux of CBAM, is that we all understand as African stakeholders that we do need to start making the change, but it's the way that we do it, and we need a much more closer partnership relationship than we currently have at the moment. And then I've just put my contact details there just in general, but otherwise, thank you very much. And I'll stop sharing.
Thank you, Kelly. That was remarkable. An insight into the implications of some of these policies is something that was quite new to me, in fact. So it's great to have heard what you said there. We'll open up the questions, and maybe I could just ask a quick one. It was an EU policy. Is there anything similar to that from other sort of major blocks, or is it
Yeah, I think the other ones, I think Japan, the UK, China, Canada, and Australia are developing similar policies, but they're not implemented yet. And I mean, South Africa is also, we have our own carbon taxation policy in place, but there's now sort of some kind of disconnect between that and CBAM. But I think that increasingly, as countries are trying to attain their own targets, they will be aware of this carbon leakage. And trying to prevent this offshoring and sort of going around the lines.
right? Thank you. Well, open up to everybody else. If you'd like to put your hand up for a question, then we can take you in turn. Any thoughts, anybody?
Otherwise, I actually have a question.
Right. Oh, well, that's
Yeah. Which,
not.
yeah, it's not usual. I'm sorry, but I am curious because obviously I have a focus on Africa because I'm South African and I've worked across the continent, and my research has looked at several countries. But how often do people think about Africa? And it's not in a negative sense. I'm not trying to sort of say aha, but just out of genuine curiosity.
Yeah, I guess we do have a very sort of UK centric view, very obviously in a way, but I guess the sort of involvement with Africa are seen as to a certain extent, it's very much an arm's length. We're not sort of directly connected to anything. Uh,
Mhm.
from our own point of view, we have worked with uh, South Africa in terms of research projects, and a little bit with Egypt as well. And there is this sort of maybe a little bit division of sub-Saharan African and North Africa. So what are you actually talking about? Yeah. But I guess no, if you think about it, it's very contained. We do think about ourselves a lot. Yeah. Don't know what anybody else. Henry, you've got some thoughts on that.
Well, I happen to have visited South Africa a few times and have neighbours, good friends who are South African. So I have a particular interest in South Africa. But also, actually, our magazine, the Mint magazine, does try to include a reasonable amount of stuff on Africa. But I was just, I shared a couple of articles anyway, that recent about the finance dimension, because I think it's a really big issue, isn't it?
Yeah.
And governments tend to have this say, "Oh well, get private finance involved; they'll sort it out." But I think these articles suggest, that just doesn't happen, mainly because of the risk around rates. Exchange rates, and a few other things. And also the development banks, which are meant to be financing, haven't really done very well. Mixed finance doesn't work well, and now the Western advanced nations or whatever are sort of totally obsessed by their own debt situation, and you think that something like this, it's classic. Okay, there's a stick with the CBAM, but you'd think there might be a carrot there to at least help with financing and so on.
Yeah.
But it just doesn't seem to be on the table, which is sort of, I think, pretty extraordinary, really.
Yeah.
And it seems to be something that really needs to be cracked. And I wouldn't be surprised if some of the nations try and move. There's always been a desire, hasn't there, within Africa for more inter-regional trade, which I don't believe has ever sort of quite got off the ground. But maybe this will give definitely a sort of push. And I wonder even, I mean, one of the articles talks about having more sort of maybe currencies, sort of regional currencies and things like that, and which debt could be in. Because the big problem with debt is if it's in a different exchange, different currency, you get totally screwed when the other people change their interest rates, etc., and exchange rates change. So I don't have any solutions, but I think I think you're absolutely right. The finance needs to be cracked, and so I do. Yeah, it's worth having a look at these the suggestions in the articles, I think.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. And you make a really good point about the currency fluctuations, because South Africa, I think our currency is one of the most traded because it's so volatile, which has obviously implications. To be honest, I don't understand it, but it's fascinating to watch and to read a little bit about that and to see how, because of that movement that it makes, how it's so. Yeah, I think it has very negative implications for us on the ground here. And then also for the perception of risk, as you say, and like, why would I invest there if the currency could bottom out next week, kind of thing. So,
Whereas, someone like the UK can have its debt in pounds, and actually, if your debt is in your local currency, there's no risk, and
yeah,
you can create your own money. There's all sorts of things. So there is a question whether, to what extent, developing countries are sort of more empowered to use their own currency, and I don't know.
yeah, yeah.
This very tricky issue.
And your point also about the kind of regional development and intra-African trade, I think there's a lot of work to be done there, but we do have these regional blocks, SADC, for example, the Southern African Development Community, ECOWAS with Nigeria, the EAC. And I know in South Africa, for example, we have this regional power pool where our Eskom, our main supplier, pumps energy into all of our neighbors. So the infrastructure's there, the billing structures are there. It's just about really shifting into renewables as opposed to coal, and then that can change the dynamic for the entire region. Also in terms of something like CBAM, especially those kind of indirect emissions. So yeah, it's a very interesting point, and I really do hope that the free trade area does accelerate that more and more. But it is still kind of being worked out at the moment. So we'll see.
Anybody else got a question? I was wondering, Kelly, whether well, Hugh, go first, yeah, before I ask.
Can I actually? I'm not an expert in Africa, but I have been to both Kenya and Uganda. We used to run masters summer schools in education for sustainability. So I know a little bit about it, but but I'm no expert. But so I do think about it and worry about it and wonder about it. Unlike many people in Europe, perhaps, who thinks it's a very strange place which has nothing to do with them. I was just wondering. Am I correct here? The recent COPs have supposedly set aside a large fund, haven't they, for developing countries in relation to tackling climate change and greener technology. Does that play a role in the CBAM process at all?
So to be honest, I'm not sure. I think it would, in the sense of trying to accelerate the production of renewable energy, for example, which would then help to change the nature of production. From what I understand, the biggest challenge with that is that the pronouncements that are made and then what actually gets invested, there's a big gap there. And the same, the EU have their gateway deal, the global gateway. And that also, it sounds like a really new large sum of money that's going to be directed at Africa, but it's really just totaling up the commitments that have been made before. And to be honest, I mean, China was the same in FOCAC. I think they also promised something like 50 billion to go to Africa. And that is also a collection of existing loans, debts, and investment projects. So I think it does. So in terms of the COPs, I think it does help in theory if it materializes and if it does help to push these countries or to build the infrastructure. Because again, the potential in all of these countries for renewables is phenomenal, and it really can unleash development and production in a way that will facilitate access to the EU market, despite CBAM. But I think it just needs to be more and more concentrated.
Right. Thank you. John.
Thank you very much for your talk. Your last slide was interesting when it referred to slowing down the implementation of CBAM. How slow do you think it should be?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think, and I don't think I necessarily agree with the slowness. I think it's more just in the sense of greater alignment and maybe a little bit more nuance in the conversation. And in the South African example, as I mentioned, there's that kind of consensus or the strong lobby around coal and around the vested interest that represents. So maybe it's around having a slower conversation in terms of bringing CBAM in line with existing, I don't know, almost the buzzwords, so that we're speaking the same language and we tie into that, and it feels like something that we are all deciding to do together as South Africans, as opposed to something that we now have to do on the part of, just because of complying with the EU. And I think that that quote, she was from the National Business Initiative, if I'm not mistaken. And I think her feeling is that we are already taking steps in South Africa. We have our own carbon taxation policies. We're working towards thinking about decarbonization. A lot of renewable has come online quite recently. We've had a big policy change. And therefore that CBAM becomes punitive, as opposed to how can we work with the EU to support what we're already doing, and then we'll meet the same goals but via a different route. So I think maybe the slowness is also there's Africa time. We like to take a bit of time. No, I'm just kidding. But I think that's really the essence of what that quote speaks to.
Thank you very much indeed, everybody. Hugh, you asked the question I was wondering about was whether the sort of the loss and damage fund was being used in any way or could be used in any way to. I was thinking more, very much about the what you mentioned, Kelly, was the burden of the bureaucracy around this, and whether there were any attempts to sort of accelerate those processes and to share across the sort of the whole region the ability to sort of comply more easily and sort of get to a point where that wasn't seen as a burden anymore.
Yeah, My feeling, and it's more of a hunch than based on research, is that a lot of organizations will be caught on the back foot. And then, so for now, I haven't seen anything like that, but I think there'll be an accelerated jump and a sudden rush to get skills, to build that capacity, and to try and find the best ways to, as you say, sort of think about partnering and developing that expertise so that organizations can comply. And I think it's really that failure of kind of the trickle down of the awareness of the policy, the details, I think that when it launched on the EU side, the documents weren't there or they weren't available for download. So there were also kind of challenges on that side, which doesn't help.
Is the just thinking about South Africa, is the sort of massiveness and the momentum of the coal industry there sort of very much the reason why it isn't like Kenya at the moment? And are there sort of really active policies in place to address that deindustrialization process that South Africa has to go through in a way?
Yeah.
Over here in the UK, we're sort of celebrating that we don't use coal anymore for power generation. Yeah, which is quite an amazing achievement given the history.
Yeah.
And presumably South Africa will be following the same path.
Yeah, yeah. I think there, what does they think? Politics shapes economics. So the political tensions and factions and infighting, I think also backdating to the Zuma era. That's what we are now dealing with. And I think that we lost a lot of momentum, and we definitely did take a step back. The coal interests and the unions, they have a lot of power, and there is a lot of vested interest in continuing the use of coal. And I think that phasing it out will now happen more rapidly. But during the Zuma era, we built a brand new, I think 2 or 3 brand new coal-fired power stations under very corrupt circumstances that are often breaking down. And so money's just absolutely been wasted in that area. And that has then led to this kind of load shedding that we've suffered for the last almost 10 years. And with that, we've had also a lot of manufacturing loss, a lot of organizations have closed. So the economy's taken a big knock. But the only upside of that is that it's forced the hand of government to bring renewables online, and to allow independent power producers to start producing. So a lot of mines are actually now generating their own power. And then, as I mentioned, I touched on it very briefly, but our actual transmission infrastructure is also very old. And then the size of the country means that there's a lot of loss. So there's a lot of work to be done. But I think that we are at least on the right track. Also, the elections that took place recently, we have a new government of national unity. So there's a lot more kind of light being shed on government processes. And there's a big push to sort of clean up, to get the corruption out and sort it out, and to really accelerate on the renewable side. So it is a tricky one. Also, because the economy's done this, job loss has been high. We have something like 40% unemployment, which means that the jobs in mining hold extra weight, and we need to really focus on that just transition to make sure that people aren't left behind. So it's they talk about those wicked problems and grand challenges. That's
Yes.
a really good case.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. Well,
Can I just say, I think, Kelly, there you touched on an important point, because with things like CBAM and everything else, if you don't have good governance and good government structures, then none of this is going to work. And you can point to Africa, but you could also point to the European Union as well, whether their governance structures as they are to be. And I used to teach a bit of European politics, and there's certain hypocrisy from the EU when they're insisting on effective carbon measures of products made in Africa going to Europe, when they have a single market where every day thousands of lorries go all across the continent taking fizzy water from one country to another. Those kind of big contradictions in the policy.
Yeah, indeed. It is a challenge. And I think the same in terms of, it's the protectionist side, agriculture, and the support that agriculture gets compared to Africa. And that's another trade barrier that holds us back. And in terms of energy, I think the Netherlands, for example, I mean, it's a tiny, tiny country, and I think they're the second or third largest exporter of food in the world, and that's all just in greenhouses, and it's so energy intensive, it's insane, which also doesn't make sense.
Absolutely.
There's a lot in this world doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
And I think but the thought occurred to me that there's a wonderful story here to be told. And I think, we need to get it out there as much as possible, and not so much necessarily the actual mechanisms of the policies, but the implementation, the consequences of everything that need to be so much thought of. And I was struck by what you said about the way that African leaders are treated when they go to China. It's so different to when they arrive here in the UK and Europe. So, that's a very strong message, I feel, that needs to get through to people. We ought to see it very differently.
Indeed. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Kelly. It's been brilliant. If you have any final comments, but otherwise, very very thoughtful. And I look forward to seeing you again soon. And yeah, thank you.
Oh, definitely. Thank you so much for inviting me. I really appreciate it. And I mean, I think my only comment is really just that it's what I say all the time, which is more and more talking. We just need more talking, more conversation, and to realize that actually we all want the same thing. And it's just about finding the middle ground and making it work. So yeah,
indeed. Telling their stories is right. Listen. Right. Thank you, everybody, very much.
Thank you so much. All the best.
Bye-bye. Take care.
Bye. I'll leave. There you go.
Thanks, Kelly. Thank you very much.
It's a pleasure.
Excellent.
Thanks for having me.
I'll let you know when the recording is done, and I'll put it up on our YouTube. And
Okay, perfect.
are you in the UK anytime soon?
I might be there either end of this year or early next year for a little while. Yeah.
Okay, will be great to meet if we can.
Yeah, definitely. I'll let you know.
Okay. Take care.
Thanks so much, you too.
No thunderstorm.
All the best.
Bye.
Bye.
Take care.
Thanks.
And